James's heart pounded as he stepped cautiously through the dimly lit hallway of his own home. The air was thick with tension, the walls closing in on him as he listened to the faint creaks of movement upstairs. He gritted his teeth. Margaret wasn't done. She had warned him, but he never expected she'd go this far. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from Lisa. "James, I don't think you're safe. I've been digging, and you won't believe what I found. Call me AP." A chill ran through his spine. He quickly texted back. "Not now. She's inside." As soon as he hit send, a loud thud echoed from above. James stiffened. Someone was definitely there. He wasn't alone. His fingers clenched around the baseball bat he had grabbed from the hall closet. If they thought they could intimidate him, they had another thing coming. With careful steps, he made his way up the stairs, each step creaking beneath his weight. The door to the master bedroom was slightly ajar. He reached out and pushed it open. Nothing, but something felt off. His gut told him he wasn't alone. Then from behind, whoosh, a shadow lunged at him. James barely ducked in time as something heavy smashed into the wall where his head had been a second earlier. He stumbled forward, whipping around, bat raised. A man, burly and dressed in dark clothing, glared at him, wielding a crowbar. "Should have left when you had the chance," the man sneered. James didn't hesitate. He swung the bat. Hard. Crack. The impact sent the man stumbling, but he recovered quickly, growling in rage. He charged at James again, swinging the crowbar wildly. James dodged, but the tip of the metal clipped his shoulder, sending sharp pain through his arm. He bit back a cry and retaliated, driving the bat into the man's gut. The intruder crumpled to his knees, gasping for air. James didn't wait. He seized the man by the collar. "Who sent you?" he demanded, shaking him. "Margaret." The man coughed, then smirked. "You don't get it, do you?" James's blood ran cold. "Get what?" The man chuckled darkly. "She's not working alone." Before James could react, the sound of police sirens blared outside. His stomach twisted. No, this wasn't happening. He rushed to the window. Red and blue lights flashed in the night. A half-dozen squad cars skidded to a stop outside his home. Officers spilled out, guns drawn. And there, standing at the front of it all, was Margaret. Her arms were crossed, a satisfied smirk on her lips. James felt his grip tighten around the bat. He turned back to the intruder, fury burning in his chest. "You set me up," he hissed. The man only laughed. "You should have never taken this house." James heard the front door slam open. Heavy boots stomped through the house. Freeze! Hands in the air. James's mind raced. He had two choices: surrender and let Margaret win, or fight back and prove the truth. Either way, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. James stood frozen as the police stormed into his home, their weapons trained on him. The flashing red and blue lights cast eerie shadows on the walls, making the whole scene feel surreal. His heart pounded in his chest, but he knew one thing for certain. This was a setup. Margaret had planned this from the start. "Drop the bat. Hands where we can see them," one officer barked. James slowly raised his hands, the bat slipping from his fingers and clattering to the floor. His mind was racing. If they arrested him now, Margaret would win. The officer closest to him grabbed his arm, yanking it behind his back. Cold steel locked around his wrist. "You have the right to remain silent." "Wait!" James shouted, struggling against the grip. "That man, he broke into my house. He attacked me. Look at him." The officer hesitated, glancing at the man still hunched over, clutching his stomach where James had struck him. Another officer approached, checking him over. "He's hurt, but he's armed," the officer reported, pointing to the crowbar. James saw an opening. "You see? He's the one who came after me. I was defending myself." But before the officers could process his words, Margaret's voice rang out from the doorway. "Officer, please," she said, her voice trembling with fake concern. "I called you here because this man broke into my home. He's dangerous. I barely got away." James turned his head sharply toward her, his eyes blazing with fury. "Liar. The lead officer looked between them, uncertainty flickering in his expression. "Ma'am, you're saying this is your house?" "Yes." Margaret nodded fervently. "It belonged to my late husband. I've lived here for decades. And now I come back to find this criminal inside." James clenched his fists. She was good, too good, but he wasn't going down that easy. "Check the records." James said firmly. "This house was foreclosed. I bought it legally. She's trespassing." A brief silence fell over the room. The officer pulled out his radio, speaking in low tones. Margaret's face twitched ever so slightly. She hadn't expected them to fact-check her story. Seconds later, the officer's radio crackled. "Confirmed. Property records show the deed was transferred to a James Anderson. No legal claim from any Margaret Winters." The room tensed. James exhaled sharply. He had them. The officer turned back to Margaret. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step outside." Margaret's mask of calm cracked. "Wait, no. This must be a mistake. That house is mine." Her voice grew shrill, desperate. She tried to push past the officers, but they blocked her. "Ma'am, step outside now," the officer repeated more forcefully. Margaret's eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal. Then, suddenly, she bolted. She spun and ran down the hallway, shoving past officers. "Hey, stop her," one of them shouted. James didn't think. He chased her. Margaret crashed through the back door, sprinting into the night. Rain had started falling again, making the ground slick. James ran after her, adrenaline surging through his veins. "You're done, Margaret," he yelled. But she wasn't heading toward the street. She was running toward the woods behind the house. James hesitated for half a second. The woods were dark, dangerous. But he couldn't let her escape. With a deep breath, he plunged in after her. Branches whipped against his face as he ran, his breathing heavy. He could hear Margaret ahead of him, her frantic footsteps splashing through the mud. Then a scream. James skidded to a stop. The sound had been sharp, panicked. He crept forward, eyes scanning the darkness. Then he saw it. Margaret was on the ground, struggling against something. Someone, a third person was there. A shadowy figure, barely visible in the night, pinning her down. James felt his blood run cold. Who the hell? Margaret's eyes locked onto James, wide with terror. And for the first time since he'd met her, she looked genuinely afraid. "James!" she screamed. "Help me!" James hesitated. Margaret was his enemy. She had tormented him, set him up, tried to ruin his life. But now she was the one in danger. And the real question was, did she deserve to be saved? James's chest heaved as he stood frozen at the edge of clearing. Rain poured down, soaking his clothes as he stared at the horrifying scene before him. Margaret, the woman who had done everything in her power to ruin him, was now at the mercy of a stranger. The shadowy figure had her pinned to the ground, their hands wrapped tightly around her throat. Margaret thrashed, clawing at the person's arms, her panic gasps barely audible over the storm. James gritted his teeth. He had every reason to walk away. Margaret had lied. She had tried to steal his home. She had called the cops on him, hoping he'd be locked away forever. And now she was pleading for his help. James took a step forward, then another. The moment his foot crunched on a wet branch, the attacker's head snapped up. James's breath caught. Lightning illuminated the figure's face for a split second, and what James saw sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't just some random criminal. It was the man from his house. The same intruder who had tried to attack him. The same man who had set him up. James's mind reeled. If this guy was working with Margaret, why was he attacking her now? The man sneered. "Didn't expect you to follow, Anderson." James's hands curled into fists. "Get off of her." The man didn't move. Instead, he pressed down harder on Margaret's throat, making her sputter. "Why should you care what happens to her?" The man taunted. "This woman tried to ruin your life. She'd have let you rot in prison if she had the chance." Margaret let out a strangled sob. Her nails raked against the man's arms, weaker now. James's jaw clenched. He knew the stranger was right. But something about this didn't sit right. You were on her side, James accused. Why turn on her now? The man smirked. Her side? He let out a dry chuckle. I was never on her side. She thought she was calling the shots, but she's just as disposable as you. Margaret whimpered. James felt his stomach tighten. What do you mean? James demanded. The man tilted his head. You really think Margaret was working alone? He let out another dark chuckle. There's someone else who wants you out of the picture. And Margaret? She was just a pawn. James's heart pounded. Who? The man only smiled. Then he pulled a knife. Lightning flashed, reflecting off the blade. James barely had time to react before the man lunged at him. Swoosh! James dodged, the knife slicing through the air inches from his ribs. He stumbled back, his feet sliding in the mud. The man advanced again, slashing wildly. James barely managed to sidestep. His pulse thundered. This guy wasn't just trying to scare him. He was trying to kill him. Margaret coughed violently on the ground, her hands clutching her throat as she tried to crawl away. James had to end this. The man lunged again. This time, James was ready. He ducked at the last second and drove his fist into the man's gut. The attacker staggered. James saw his opening. He grabbed a fallen branch in the ground and swung it with everything he had. Crack! The man collapsed. The knife slipped from his fingers, disappearing into the wet grass. James stood over him, panting. He wanted to end this, to make sure this guy never came after him again. But then, Margaret screamed. James spun around. His stomach dropped. A second figure stood at the edge of the clearing, watching, a dark silhouette against the trees. And then, before James could react, the figure turned and disappeared into the night. James's blood ran cold. How many of them were there? James stood frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears. The second figure had vanished into the trees, swallowed by the darkness. Someone else was involved. Someone powerful enough to orchestrate everything. Margaret coughed violently on the ground, her frail body trembling in the mud. The first attacker lay motionless nearby, unconscious from James's brutal strike. James's mind raced. He had thought this fight was between him and Margaret, but it wasn't. She was just another pawn. He turned to her, his voice cold. Who was that? Margaret looked up, her face pale with fear. She didn't answer. James crouched down, grabbing her wrist. Margaret, who are you working for? She flinched. You don't understand. If I talk, I'm dead. James tightened his grip. You're already as good as dead if you don't. They just tried to kill you. Do you really think they'll let you walk away? Margaret's breath hitched. She knew he was right. James could see it in her eyes, the realization that she was disposable, the same way she had treated him. Tears welled up in her eyes. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I was just supposed to get you out of the house, make you look guilty, but then... She swallowed hard. Then they wanted you gone. For good. James felt a cold chill run down his spine. Who? Before he could press her further, the unconscious man groaned. James whirled around. The man was waking up. Margaret gasped in terror. No, he'll kill me. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed a length of rope from a fallen branch pile nearby and tied the man's hands behind his back. The attacker stirred, his head lolling to the side. James crouched down beside him. You work for someone, don't you? The man let out a low chuckle, despite his bloody face. You're smarter than you look, Anderson. James clenched his jaw. Who hired you? The man smirked, his swollen lip curling. Oh, you'll find out soon enough. James's hands tightened into fists. He was done playing games. He grabbed the man's shirt and yanked him forward. Tell me now. The man only laughed. You think you've won? You have no idea what's coming. James's stomach twisted. Margaret whimpered. James, please. We need to get out of here. James knew she was right. The second figure could still be lurking nearby, but before they could move, a car engine roared in the distance. James's head snapped up. Headlights pierced through the trees. Margaret screamed. It's them. James grabbed her arm, dragging her up. Run. But it was too late. The car skidded to a stop on the dirt path. The doors burst open. Two men jumped out, both armed. James's heart pounded. He recognized one of them, not from the attack, not from Margaret, but from his past. His breath caught. No, it can't be. The taller man stepped forward, a smirk playing on his lips. It's been a long time, James. Margaret was shaking violently. Oh, God! Oh, God! James's fists clenched. You're behind this. The man shrugged. I told you before, you don't belong here. James's blood turned to ice, because now he knew exactly who was trying to destroy him. James stared at the man standing before him, his mind racing. He knew this face. It was Jonathan Reed, a man from his past, a man who had made his life a living hell in college. Jonathan had been the entitled rich boy, always looking down on James, always making sure he knew his place. And now he was here, pulling the strings. James's fists clenched. You're behind all this? Jonathan smirked, his hands tucked into his coat pockets like he wasn't standing in the middle of a crime scene. I told you before, Jonathan said, voice smooth and condescending. People like you don't belong in our world. Margaret gasped beside James, eyes darting between them. Wait, you two know each other? James didn't break eye contact. Yeah, and I should have known he'd still be the same arrogant piece of trash. Jonathan let out a mocking chuckle. Oh, James, I told you back then, you'd never amount to anything. And yet, you really thought you could move into a neighborhood like mine? James's stomach twisted. It had never been just about Margaret. Jonathan had been the one orchestrating this from the start. James narrowed his eyes. Let me guess. You were the one who convinced Margaret to set me up. Jonathan chuckled. Oh, she was easy. A bitter, lonely old woman? All I had to do was whisper in her ear, remind her how much she hated the idea of you living in that house. And she did the rest. Margaret looked sick. Her voice trembled. You used me? Jonathan turned to her with an amused expression. Oh, don't look so surprised. You were never in charge. You were just a convenient tool. Margaret's face fell. Her entire world shattered in that moment. James, on the other hand, he was done. You tried to ruin me before, James said, his voice steady. And you failed. He took a step closer, his eyes burning with fire. And now you failed again. Jonathan laughed. You really think you've won? You think you can just stand there and act like everything's fine? We own this town, James. I can make one call and you'll be... Sirens. Jonathan's smirk vanished. His head snapped toward the road just as red and blue lights flashed through the trees. James let out a slow breath. Looks like your time's up, he said. Jonathan took a step back. Panic flickered in his eyes. You called the cops? James crossed his arms. Nah, Margaret did. Jonathan whirled around. Margaret stood there, her phone clutched in her shaking hands. She had made the call, and now she was done protecting the monster who had used her. Tires screeched. Doors slammed. Officers flooded the scene. Jonathan turned to run, but he didn't get far. 3 cops tackled him to the ground. He thrashed, shouting, but it was over. The officers quickly moved to arrest Jonathan's men. The attacker James had knocked out was already restrained. It was over. James exhaled. For the first time in months, he could breathe. Margaret took a shaky step forward. She looked up at James, guilt written all over her face. I don't expect forgiveness, she murmured, but I am sorry. James studied her for a long moment. You should be, he finally said. Margaret lowered her head. What will you do now? James turned toward his house. His house. The same house Margaret had tried to keep him from. The same house Jonathan had fought to take away. And now it was his. He turned back to Margaret, his voice steady, powerful. I'm going home. James walked past her, past the flashing lights, past the wreckage of night. He climbed his porch steps, his hand tightening around the doorknob. And then he stepped inside. Margaret watched from the driveway, her face pale, her entire world unraveling. Jonathan was dragged toward a police car, his eyes blazing with rage. But James? James stood in the doorway of his house, Looking out at them one last time, he didn't have to say a word, because, in the end, racist woman tells black man get out, but he's the new homeowner. What a story. Justice has been served. But tell me, do you think Margaret truly learned her lesson? What about Jonathan? Will he ever change? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this again. This has been Struggles to Triumph. Until next time, stay strong.